Nathaniel Nate Dawson rolled his shoulders as he settled deeper into the driver's seat, exhaling slow and measured. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, the highway bathed in the muted glow of flickering streetlights. Midnight had passed an hour ago, and now the world was quiet, the kind of quiet that made everything feel distant, weightless. Soft jazz filtered through the car's speakers, the lazy sway of a saxophone humming low against the steady drone of tires on pavement. The music was familiar, comforting in a way only old tunes could be. His fingers tapped absently against the wheel, following the rhythm, a habit picked up from years of long drives. It had been a hell of a week. Endless meetings, firm handshakes, the carefully measured conversations of men who made decisions behind closed doors. He had played his part, as he always did, but it wore on him. Now there was only one thing on his mind: home. Nate wasn't in uniform tonight. Just a simple gray t-shirt, worn jeans, sneakers, nothing that set him apart from any other man driving home after a long trip. He preferred it that way. There was a certain kind of anonymity that came with it, a freedom from the weight of expectations. The uniform had its own kind of power, but out here in the stillness of the night, he didn't want to be Lieutenant Commander Dawson. He just wanted to be a man on the road. The highway signs flashed past, counting down the miles. He was close now. 20 minutes, maybe less. The thought of a hot shower, the familiar scent of his apartment, and the weight of sleep pulling him under, it was enough to keep him going. Then, in the rearview mirror, something broke through the solitude. Red and blue lights, flashing, gaining. His grip on the wheel tightened, the music suddenly too soft, too distant. He felt it in his chest first. Not fear, not yet, but something else. A quiet bracing, a familiar weight settling in his stomach. This wasn't new. He signaled, changed lanes, and eased his car onto the shoulder. The patrol car followed, headlights bouncing against the wet pavement, bathing his rear window in a harsh, artificial glow. Nate took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had been in the military long enough to know the drill, but that didn't mean he didn't hate it. The flashing red and blue lights pulsed against the darkened road, casting shifting shadows across the pavement. Nathaniel Nate Dawson exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to stay even. He signaled, changed lanes, and guided his car onto the shoulder, tires crunching over loose gravel before rolling to a stop. The patrol car followed, pulling up just behind him, its high beams flooding the interior of Nate's vehicle with a harsh white glare. He could see the silhouette of the officer inside, taking his time, making a point. Nate kept his hands on the wheel, fingers relaxed but deliberate. He had been trained for moments like this. Not just in the military, but in life. The unspoken rules, the things men like him had to remember. No sudden movements. Keep your voice calm, hands visible at all times. He rolled down the window just as the officer finally stepped out. Boots scuffed against asphalt. Slow, heavy footsteps. The kind of pace that wasn't just casual, it was controlled, assertive. A man approaching with the confidence of someone who expected compliance. The beam of a flashlight cut through the window, landing on Nate's face. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation, just a demand, flat and impatient. Nate turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the officer's nameplate. Briggs. He met the man's gaze in the side mirror, his expression unreadable. Yes, officer. His voice was even, steady. May I ask why I was stopped? Briggs didn't answer right away. He held out his hand expectantly, the flashlight tilting just enough to keep Nate partially blinded. License, he repeated, a beat past. Then, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, Nate reached for the glove compartment, retrieving his registration before pulling his wallet from the console. He handed the documents over, watching as Briggs barely glanced at them before tucking them under his arm. Taillights out, the officer said. Nate frowned. That wasn't right. He had checked his car just last week before leaving for his trip. Everything had been in working order. Are you sure? He asked. Careful with his tone. I had it inspected recently. Briggs finally looked at him directly, and there it was, the shift, a flicker of something behind the man's eyes. Not concern, not professionalism, control. You arguing with me? Briggs asked, his smirk barely visible in the dim light. Nate held his gaze for half a second longer than most people probably would have. Then, deciding it wasn't worth it, not yet, he exhaled through his nose. No, sir. Just surprised, that's all. Briggs tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then, just as casually as before, he shifted his stance and gave the order, "Step out of the vehicle." And just like that, the air between them changed. Nate's fingers flexed subtly against the wheel. His breath stayed steady, his expression unreadable, but inside something coiled tight in his chest. He knew this game. He had seen it play out before, on the news, in conversations whispered among friends, and the lessons his father had drilled into him as a teenager. Stay calm, stay respectful, but never forget, you're being tested. He kept his voice even. "Officer, I'm not refusing, but could you tell me why you're asking me to step out of the car?" Briggs exhaled sharply, like the question alone was an offense. His flashlight tilted slightly, its beam no longer directly in Nate's face, but still aggressive, still intrusive. "Because I said so," Briggs replied, his smirk widening. Nate let a slow breath slip through his nose. He could feel it now, the shift in power, the unspoken tension stretching between them. This wasn't about a taillight. It never was. Briggs wanted a reaction. He wanted compliance, but more than that, he wanted submission. And when Nate didn't immediately cave, it irritated him. "Step out of the car." The officer's tone hardened, his patience thinning. Nate's pulse ticked slightly higher, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate control. He moved with the kind of precision that had been drilled into him during his years in the military. Controlled, measured, calculated. As he pushed the door open and stepped out onto the asphalt, the night air was cooler than he expected. The road ahead stretched dark and empty. No passing cars, no witnesses, just the steady hum of the patrol car's engine filling the silence. Briggs took a step closer, his posture radiating authority, like a man who had never had his power questioned. His hand rested near his belt, not on his gun, not yet, but close enough to send a message. Nate knew better than to provoke. He kept his stance neutral, his hands visible. Every move mattered. "You got a problem following orders?" Briggs asked, tilting his head. Nate met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't have a problem, officer. Just want to understand what's happening." Briggs let out a short, humorless chuckle. And the way he said it, like the very idea of a black man questioning him was amusing, like it was ridiculous, sent a slow burn through Nate's chest. Then, in one quick motion, Briggs reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the receiver, his smirk widening. Nate felt his jaw tighten slightly. This was bad. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because he wasn't in control of himself, but because men like Briggs never needed a reason. The moment Briggs reached for his radio, Nate knew how this would play out. He had seen it before. The manufactured escalation, the way the script always seemed to write itself. A black man dares to ask questions, dares to challenge even slightly, and suddenly, he's a threat. Briggs stepped in closer, the artificial glow of the patrol car lights flickering across his face. "Turn around. Hands on the car." Nate didn't move immediately, not out of defiance, but because he knew hesitation alone was enough to be twisted against him. For what reason? His voice was steady, controlled. Briggs's smirk vanished. "You're resisting." There it was. The accusation had nothing to do with reality, just a convenient excuse, a word that carried weight, a word that could justify anything. Before Nate could respond, Briggs grabbed his wrist, yanking it behind his back. Fast, rough, unnecessary. The other arm followed just as quickly, and then metal. The cuffs clicked into place, too tight, biting into his skin. Deliberate. A message. Nate's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Pain wasn't the problem. He had been through worse. Much worse. What mattered now was control, not Briggs' control, his own. Because the moment he reacted, the moment he so much as tensed the wrong way, he became exactly what Briggs wanted him to be. "A little more cooperative, Lieutenant Commander," Briggs muttered, voice laced with mockery. "Might have saved yourself some trouble." The title, Lieutenant Commander, rolled off his tongue like an insult, like a joke. Nate let out a slow, steady breath. He knows. Maybe Briggs had known from the start. Maybe he had just looked Nate up when he ran his license. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that even knowing Nate's rank, even knowing who he was, Briggs still didn't hesitate, because men like him never expected consequences. Briggs tightened his grip on Nate's arm and shoved him forward. "Let's take a ride." Nate didn't resist, but as Briggs pushed him toward the patrol car, as the cuffs dug deeper into his skin, one thing became clear. He wasn't going to let this slide. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car pressed into Nate's back as the engine rumbled to life. His wrists throbbed where the cuffs dug into his skin, but he barely noticed. Pain was temporary. This wasn't. Outside, the red and blue lights flickered against the empty highway, casting their glow across the wet pavement. The road stretched ahead, leading not just to the station, but into a long night of bullshit. Briggs slid into the driver's seat, whistling as he buckled in, one hand lazily gripping the wheel. His mood had shifted, relaxed, victorious, like a man who had done this before, who had no reason to second-guess his actions. "You know," he mused, throwing the car into gear, "most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Nate didn't respond. He wasn't going to give him anything. Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. "But nah, you had to ask questions, had to be difficult." He glanced at Nate through the rearview mirror, smirking. "Bet you thought dropping that little lieutenant commander title would make me back off." Silence. Briggs clicked his tongue. "See, that's the problem with you people." There it was. No hesitation, no filter, just raw, unapologetic arrogance. "You think you're untouchable," he continued, like he was explaining something simple. "Get a little power, put on a uniform, and suddenly you think the rules don't apply." He shook his head, like the very idea annoyed him. "You ain't special." Nate exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. "Not yet. Not here." Briggs was trying to bait him, looking for any reaction that could justify what he had already done. But Nate had learned a long time ago that sometimes the best move is no move at all. So he sat there, silent, letting Briggs talk, letting him dig his own grave. Because what Briggs didn't know, what he hadn't even considered, was that Nate was not the kind of man who let things go. Briggs thought he had won, but what he didn't realize was that Nate had already started playing a different game. The police station loomed ahead, a squat, gray building sitting just off the main road. Its dull fluorescent lights buzzed against the night, casting sterile shadows across the near-empty parking lot. The moment the patrol car rolled to a stop, Briggs stepped out, slamming the door behind him with just a little too much force. Nate exhaled through his nose, staring straight ahead. It was starting. Briggs yanked the back door open, gripping Nate's arm with a little too much enthusiasm as he pulled him from the vehicle. "Let's go," he muttered, leading him toward the entrance. Nate walked without resistance, his posture straight, his steps controlled. His wrists throbbed from the too tight cuffs, but he refused to acknowledge it. Pain was temporary. The real fight was just beginning. Inside, the air smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. A bored-looking desk sergeant sat behind a thick pane of glass, barely glancing up as Briggs led Nate through processing. Briggs was still enjoying himself, still convinced he was in control. "You think you're smart, huh?" He muttered under his breath as he shoved Nate toward a metal bench. Nate simply looked at him. No response, no reaction. Let him talk. Let him think he's winning. But then something changed. A younger officer approached from the side hallway, clutching a clipboard, his expression uncertain. "Sergeant Briggs," he said, voice hesitant. Briggs didn't even turn. "Not now, Baker." Sir." Baker shifted on his feet, lowering his voice. "We got a call." Briggs stilled, just for a second. Then, just as quickly, he covered it up. "A call from who?" he asked, irritation creeping into his voice. Baker swallowed. "From higher up. They're asking questions about the arrest." The shift was small, but Nate caught it. Briggs's shoulders tensed, the first sign of something cracking beneath the surface. Still, he scoffed. "So," Baker hesitated. "So, they want to know why we're holding a lieutenant commander without probable cause." The room went quiet. The bored desk sergeant finally looked up. A murmur passed through the few officers lingering near the front desk. Nate didn't move. Didn't have to. Because now, the weight of the situation was sinking in. Briggs's smirk faltered, his fingers curled into fists. He turned, looking at Nate for the first time not as a target, but as a problem. And Nate, calm, collected, utterly unshaken, just leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He met Briggs' eyes. Didn't blink. Didn't speak. Didn't have to. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight. The air was crisp, the polished wood benches reflecting the sterile overhead lighting. Nate stood near the defendant's table, his posture straight, composed. His hands were free now, no cuffs, no chains, just the cold reality that this moment was about to decide everything. Across the room, Briggs sat stiffly in his seat, his confidence no longer as effortless as it had been the night before. Good. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the bailiff's voice rang out. All rise for the Honorable Judge Benjamin Dawson. Everything inside Nate stilled. For a split second, he thought he had misheard. Then, as the figure stepped onto the bench, reality slammed into him. His father. Judge Benjamin Dawson moved with quiet authority, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his glasses and settled into his seat. Nate hadn't seen him in over a year. Their relationship had always been distant. Not broken, not hostile, just strained in a way neither of them ever seemed to have the time or the patience to fix. And now, this. Briggs didn't react at first. Why would he? To him, this was just another judge, another case he assumed he would talk his way through. Nate swallowed the sharp exhale, threatening to escape. He wasn't sure whether this was fate, irony, or just another test he hadn't signed up for. His father's voice cut through the silence, steady, firm. All right, let's get to it. The prosecutor, a man in a neatly pressed suit, stood. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Nathaniel Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. A murmur rippled through the room. Nate didn't turn to look at Briggs, but he could feel it. The slow unraveling, the shift. Judge Dawson's gaze flickered briefly to Nate before settling on Briggs. His voice remained level. Sergeant Briggs, care to explain? Briggs cleared his throat, straightening in his seat. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. The prosecutor didn't even let him finish. Uncooperative? He lifted a document from the table. Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career, multiple commendations, no history of criminal activity. Are you telling me that this man was such a threat that you had to arrest him over a broken taillight? Briggs opened his mouth, then shut it. The room went silent again. And then, realization. Briggs's eyes darted between Nate and the judge, the pieces starting to click into place. Too late. For the first time since this began, Briggs looked uneasy. Because now he wasn't just dealing with some random man on the road. He was facing Judge Benjamin Dawson. And if there was one thing everyone in this courtroom knew, it was this. Judge Dawson didn't tolerate bullshit. The courtroom felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the weight of too many eyes pressing down on Briggs. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. The prosecutor took his time flipping through the file in his hands, making sure everyone in the room felt the gravity of what he was about to say. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady, deliberate, calculated. We have evidence that not only was Lieutenant Commander Dawson unlawfully detained, but that Sergeant Briggs has a well-documented history of misconduct. A low murmur rippled through the room. Briggs' jaw clenched. That wasn't supposed to happen. This, the prosecutor continued, lifting a document, is a report from Internal Affairs. It details multiple complaints against Sergeant Briggs, all involving black civilians, all following a suspiciously similar pattern. He turned another page. Routine stops that led to escalations. Arrests without cause. Reports filed but never pursued. Nate didn't move. Didn't have to. Briggs, however, was shifting in his seat now. The prosecutor wasn't finished. And then he tapped a final document, his expression sharp, almost amused. There's the body cam footage. A beat of silence. Then the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, and everything changed. The video played clear as day. Briggs's voice barking orders. Nate's voice calm, measured, asking reasonable questions. Briggs tightening the cuffs. Briggs smirking. Briggs enjoying it. The courtroom was dead silent when the footage ended. And then, finally, Judge Benjamin Dawson turned his full attention to Briggs. His gaze was unreadable, but his voice was cold. Do you have anything to say? Briggs opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. Then desperation. Your Honor, he started, his voice tight, forced. I was following protocol. Judge Dawson didn't blink. Protocol? Briggs swallowed. The defendant, Lieutenant Commander Dawson. The correction cut through the air like a blade. Briggs hesitated, rattled now. Lieutenant Commander Dawson was uncooperative. He refused to step out of the vehicle when instructed. The prosecutor's eyebrows lifted. The footage shows otherwise. Briggs's grip on the table tightened. He questioned my authority. Judge Dawson's expression didn't change. Since when is questioning an officer a crime? Briggs had no answer. The silence stretched, suffocating as the reality of the situation finally sank in. For the first time in his career, Briggs had no badge to hide behind, no power to abuse, no control, and no way out. The weight of the silence in the courtroom was unbearable. The tension had built to the breaking point, and now there was nowhere left for Sergeant Daniel Briggs to hide. Judge Benjamin Dawson let the quiet stretch, his expression unreadable as he tapped his fingers against the wooden bench. Then finally, he exhaled through his nose and spoke. Sergeant Briggs, his voice was steady, cold, final. You violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. Briggs sat rigid, his face flushed, hands clenched into fists on the table. His jaw worked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to find one last escape. But there were none. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed. The gavel came down, sharp, decisive. It was over. The room exhaled all at once, a wave of murmurs, shifting bodies, stolen glances. But Briggs didn't move. He just sat there, frozen, like a man realizing, too late, that he had already lost. Judge Dawson wasn't finished. He turned toward the prosecution. I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct. The words landed like a hammer. Briggs stiffened. There it was. The real punishment. Dismissed charges were one thing, but an internal investigation? That meant scrutiny. That meant oversight. That meant his entire career, every questionable arrest, every abuse of power would be laid bare. Briggs sucked in a breath, shaking his head slightly. Your Honor, Judge Dawson didn't even acknowledge him. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel hitting wood felt like the final nail in a coffin. Briggs sat there, his world unraveling in real time. Across the room, Nate exhaled slowly. He had never doubted the outcome. Not really, but that didn't mean it hadn't cost him something. The shuffle of bodies filled the air as people began to clear out, but Nate didn't move just yet, because his father was still seated at the bench. Judge Dawson watched him, not just as a judge, but as something more. The tension between them was unspoken but heavy. Neither man spoke. Then, finally, Judge Dawson gave the smallest of nods, acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not warmth, but something. And for now, that was enough. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. The crowd had already gathered, reporters, onlookers, people who had followed the case from the moment the footage hit the internet. Nate stepped down the courthouse stairs, his posture straight, his face unreadable. He had expected attention, but this was bigger. Cameras flashed, voices called out. Lieutenant Commander Dawson, how do you feel about the case? Do you think this will lead to changes in police policy? What would you say to others who have experienced what you did? He didn't stop, didn't answer. Not yet. Briggs had been the spark, but the fire was already spreading. Headlines flashed across news sites. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested, internal investigation launched. The video had gone viral. People were talking, and now they were listening. But Nate knew this wasn't just about him. He wasn't the first. And if nothing changed, he wouldn't be the last. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Dawson remained at his bench, watching the courtroom empty. The weight of the case lingered, heavier than the sound of shuffling papers and retreating footsteps. Nate hadn't expected him to reach out, which was why he was surprised when, just as he turned toward the exit, his father's voice cut through the space between them. Nathaniel. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't distant either. Nate turned. Judge Dawson studied him, the sharpness in his expression softened by something almost imperceptible. You handled yourself well today. Nate's jaw tightened slightly. Wouldn't have had to if I hadn't been in cuffs last night. A beat of silence. Then Judge Dawson nodded. No, you wouldn't have. It wasn't an apology, but coming from his father, it was close. For the first time in years, Nate saw something in the man's eyes that wasn't just judgment or expectation. It was understanding. Maybe this conversation wouldn't fix everything, but maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Later, as Nate stood at a quiet street corner watching the city move on around him, his phone buzzed with a message from his attorney. Briggs has been suspended. Full investigation underway. Expect more fallout. Nate exhaled. Good. But he also knew something else. This fight wasn't just his. It never had been, because power unchecked is power abused. And the only way to change the system was to hold it accountable.